everyone. Thank you so much for joining Inspira Advantage's webinar on tips and strategies for acing the MCAT. We have two great panelists here with us today who are going to help us walk through what the MCAT contains, strategies for acing it. Inspira Advantage is a company that helps students through the med school application process, and beyond that, different tests, residency applications as well. And we have great people like our panelists here today who partner with clients to guide them through that. All right, we'll dive right in. So we'll introduce our panelists, talk about what the MCAT is, the sections. We'll go through sample questions and how to strategies for getting through those. We'll talk about studying strategies, where to start, what to do on test day, and then we'll open things up for a Q&A. So today we have Aditya and Neil with us. Aditya, can you give us a little background on yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Aditya. I'm currently a radiology resident at Mayo Clinic, but I just did medical school at Mayo Clinic as well at the Arizona campus. Happy to be here. Great,
thanks so much. And Neil, thanks for joining us as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Neil. I went to Michigan for medical school and am now an NYU resident in dermatology. Up in New York, been with Inspira for a while and excited to teach you guys a little bit about the MCAT.
Great, thank you both so much. So about the MCAT, what's the MCAT and what's the purpose of the MCAT?
Yeah, so we'll get more into the finer details later in the presentation, but basically, I'm sure if you guys, most of you already know, it's the standardized exam that is needed for any sort of medical school admissions. Typically, you take it at the end of your undergraduate career, or if you're taking a gap year, sometimes you can take it in between those years as well. So essentially, the purpose is to make sure that you have the skills and knowledge capacity that it takes to succeed within medical school. And it's kind of a proxy that a lot of schools use to see how academically proficient you can be and how well you'll be able to do in their programs.
Great, thanks so much. Neil, do you have any other thoughts here?
No, I agree. That was a great summary.
Awesome. So the content, the MCAT contents.
Yes, so broadly, the MCAT is divided into 4 major sections. Again, these sections are sort of designed both to test what you've learned in undergrad or what you were taught in your core medical school classes. And they have applicability in medical school and in the medical sciences moving forward as well. It may not seem like everything is directly applicable, but in some way, I promise you it is. The 4 sections have long names, but can generally be divided into chemistry and physics, biology, psychology, psychiatry, and the critical reasoning and analysis, or CARS as it's abbreviated.
Great. All right, so we'll dive into each of these sections.
So the first section that we'll talk about is biological and biochemical foundations of living systems. So as Neil was saying before, this section is pretty heavily bio-based. So a lot of the classes that you've taken from your general biology courses, however number of semesters that you're required to take now, as well as biochemistry questions can show up in this exam section. Typically for the MCAT, there are 2 types of questions that you'll come across. One will be passage-based. So for a lot of these, they might be an article about a recent biological discovery or something about the scientific process, and then you'll be answering 4 to 6 questions per set. Even though it seems like it's a comprehension-based setup, they're actually asking you more scientific questions. And then you'll have 15 independent questions, just kind of free knowledge at the end. You have about 95 minutes for this section. And again, it tests mainly biology, biochemistry, but then there can be some combination of organic chemistry and other chemical concepts as well.
Great. Neil, anything to add here before we dive into a sample question?
No, not at all. And I think you'll see that some of the sections can kind of, but we can see that in the sample question coming up.
Great. And so the goal for the sample questions is really for us to not necessarily talk about the scientific content of the question, but ways that you can go about looking at these questions and strategies that you can take during the exam to come to the right answer.
Yeah. So taking a look at the sample question, you guys can sort of read it on your own as well, but they're basically asking about a new test that's kind of been developed to find proteins in urine. The issue that's arisen is this precipitation of a compound called calcium phosphate. So they're asking which of the procedures could prevent the precipitation of the salt. They're basically asking you to understand, what sort of reactions would produce a precipitate, what conditions in that reaction might result in the precipitation of such a compound, and in answers A through D, how would you prevent that precipitation? And you can see here how it's kind of tying in organic chemistry, maybe sort of acid-base chemistry, but kind of putting in the context of biology as in like a urine test that we might apply in a clinical setting.
Great. Aditya, are there any kind of things that stand out to you here that you would kind of look at first while going through this question before you make a decision on what the right answer might be?
Yeah, so basically when I read through a question like this, I just try to ask myself me to know or be aware of to really answer this question. So when I look at this and again, the way they lay out the answers kind of gives you some clues as well. A lot of it's like at least half of these answers are referencing pH in some way. So it gets me thinking, is there some disruption or change in pH that is causing this precipitation of this new substance? And so what do I need to do? What changed? And so what do I need to do to get it back to what it was before? And based off that, I would choose B as the answer, adding a buffer, because it seems like it was a pH imbalance that caused that substance to form.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to point out too, Aditya did a great job talking about test-taking strategies there. Just looking at the question, right, I don't remember organic chemistry that well, but I know calcium phosphate is being produced here, and you probably want to produce less of it per the question. So if you're adding calcium hydroxide or sodium phosphate, things that contain calcium or phosphate, using test-taking skills, you can probably reason that those might be wrong answers. So a lot of this can come down to just good test-taking skills as well.
Great.
And yeah, I can go ahead and take this. So the answer, like Aditya astutely pointed out, is B. And basically they're asking, like we discussed, to point out what change in the experimental or scientific approach would result in the elimination of this complication that they've been experiencing in the question stem. And it requires some reasoning about how changing the experiment might result in that desired outcome, and some, just evaluation of the questions and test-taking skills that could help you out.
Great. Aditya, anything else to add here?
No, nothing else to add. Thanks for the explanation, Neil.
Yeah. All right.
Neil, do you want to take this one, or should I go ahead?
Yeah, I can start this one. So the next section that we're discussing, sort of in a similar vein to the previous one, is chemical and physical foundations of biological systems, which may sound to you like just a different way to phrase the first section, but it is a bit different. This one consists of 9 multiple choice questions, which some are passage based, so require some comprehension. Again, more scientific in basis than something like the critical analysis and reasoning section, which you'll see later. Not a ton of questions per passage, maybe 4 to 6, and 15 that are independent of the passages entirely and are more scientific in basis, requiring like a hard knowledge of some scientific subjects. Again, about 95 minutes, testing some of the similar concepts here. The big change here is going to be physics. So you're going to see some physics tested here, which you probably did not see previously. That might include mechanical physics, electromagnetic physics, things that you would learn in core physics classes.
Great. Aditya, anything else to add here?
Nothing else. We can go through a sample question. We can again kind of discuss some test-taking strategies.
Great. And I think that 9 is incorrect, and I think that should be 90.
Oh,
I
yeah.
wish it was 9. But no, it's 90. Yeah.
All right.
All right, so the sample question we have here is choose the option that best describes what the basal layer of the epidermis and the innermost lining of the small intestine have in common. So before we go through the answer choices, one thing I want to point out. So if you notice, this question stem is a lot smaller than the one previous. And so again, different types of knowledge bases that they're asking you for. In the previous one, there were a lot of maybe clues that you can kind of rely on. On this one, this is more of a just core knowledge question. You need to know the qualities of the cells in the epidermis and the cells in the small intestine, and then you just kind of go through the answers and try to see if they line up. So for example, again, I'm going to read each one of these answers and see if they kind of make sense with the epidermis and the small intestine. So 2 non-dividing tissues right off the bat, I don't think that's the right answer. Skin regenerates quite a bit, small intestine as well, a lot of turnover, a lot of metabolic activity, so I don't think that's going to be the case. And you just kind of go through that with each question and see if that lines up. The one that's correct in this case is D. The cells of each option are connected by tight junctions. And that makes sense if you understand just the anatomy and the physiology behind these 2 surfaces. There need to be tight junctions for the skin so that you have that protective barrier. And then for the small intestine as well, because it only wants to absorb certain things, not everything that goes through the GI tract.
Great. Neil, any thoughts here before we move on to the explanation?
No, that was perfect. Also, you can see this might be a little bit more relevant to the medical school education you'll be receiving later on as well.
So yes, we're 2 for 2, thankfully. we should hopefully be, since we're so far along. But the correct answer is D. And again, just kind of going through that thought process of relying on your base knowledge, and then it's almost like you're a detective. You go through the answers and you just kind of be very critical about which ones you think are going to be right.
Great. All right. Let's move on. Next section here.
Yeah. So the next section that we have is psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior. So this back when we were studying for the MCAT, this was kind of like the up and coming test section. There was a lot more psychology and sociology that was incorporated into this exam, but essentially takes the same form as the other one. There's 59 multiple choice questions. A lot of them are passage based, and then they'll ask you a lot of questions about certain types of psychological frameworks, like the framework of identity, the framework of how does personality interact with like rational knowledge and things like that. And so this one is fairly different than the other ones. There's a lot more of psychology and sociology. It can be one where you can get a lot of points but it's also one that a lot of people maybe don't spend as much time on because it's not as knowledge intensive as the other sections. However, I'd highly recommend that you definitely spend a lot of time on this section as well, because this is where you can definitely get some buffer on points on the test overall.
Great. Neil, any thoughts here as well?
Yeah, I tended to like this section too, just because I think one way to look at it is that there are a couple different types of questions on the MCAT. Some are just based in pure knowledge, like you can get this from reading the MCAT test preparation materials. This is largely one of those where a lot of it is based on definitions and you can get a lot of free points. So instead of reasoning things out like in critical reading where things might be a little murky, this one, like Aditya said, is good for racking up the points. Which you can probably see in the sample question, which states, which of the following statements represents the prediction of cultural capital, in quotes, as a concept? So 4 answers here. A, the cultural distinctions we associate with young people will be considered to have a higher value within a society. This mentions the word value. Capital is in the words in quotation marks. I think that could be a possibility. Again, I don't remember social psychology super well, so we'll see how this goes. B, the cultural practices of all classes will converge over time with improved communication. I'm going to knock that one out. It doesn't really make sense based on the question stem. C, class-based cultural distinctions will gradually decrease in importance in the midst of a recession since most people will have less money. Generally, these questions or these answers that are so literal that they make you want to pick them are the red herrings of the pack. So you usually want to avoid those. I think this is one of those situations. And then the cultural distinctions that are associated with the upper classes of a society will be considered to have a higher value within the society. Again, mentioning value, cultural distinctions, upper classes. I think this is probably the right answer. And I think this is probably just knowing the definition of cultural capital. I'm going to go with D.
All right.
So
got it right.
Yeah, D is the correct answer. And yeah, the rationale is just you have to have a solid understanding of the concept of cultural capital. So again, these questions largely based on just book knowledge, and a good way to pick up points if you study it well.
Yeah. And Hallie, if I may add, do you mind going back to that previous slide? I just want to point something out that Neil did. So he made the question easier for himself by first going through all the choices. He automatically knocked out 2 of them, B and C. So he just upped his chance of getting the question right from 25 to now 50%. And then you just read the 2 that he has left side by side. So cultural distinctions, they pretty much match up until young people versus upper classes. And so which one relates more to capital? Would it be younger generations or would it be more of the upper classes? And that's why he chose D. And so again, that's another test taking strategy. You can make the question easier for yourself. Don't get intimidated by the fact that the answer questions or the answer stems are so long. Again, the longest one may be the red herring at some points.
Great. And I also like that you just pointed out that, like, to know the right answer to this question, you kind of have to have an understanding of cultural capital, but you can reason through this without maybe remembering that.
Yeah.
All right, so talk about cars, and then we don't have a sample question for this just because it's so long and would take up a lot of time. But would love for both of you, after we get through this slide, just talk about some thoughts that you have for kind of tackling this section.
Yeah. So for cars, this one can be the most difficult one for some people, just because, again, like other sections, you can rely on knowledge base, and if you study a lot and memorize everything, you can get through those sections. But in this one, there's nothing really to memorize. It's just about reading things on the spot and understanding what they're trying to ask you. So you have everything will be passage based here, and you'll have 5 to 7 comprehension questions where they'll try to ask you to infer certain things or analyze kind of like the subtext behind what they're giving you. And they're not necessarily science passages either, which is probably some of the difficulty as well. If you've taken like the SAT or ACT, you've already had experience with this sort of section. It always keeps coming back. Everyone puts a lot of emphasis on reading comprehension. And sometimes the best way to prepare for this is either, high reps of going through practice questions in this section. Maybe if you're up for it, reading a little bit more of a variety of different texts, not like full novels, but, trying to read a little bit more and try to get a better grasp at understanding like the subtext and the analysis behind what you're reading. Things like journal articles, things like that, just to kind of get used to the practice of reading things quickly and still being able to understand most of it.
Great. Neil, anything else to add here?
Yeah. I think that was great. I liked how many times you mentioned subtext, because that's critical in critical analysis and reasoning. A lot of times what they're going to throw at you is some paragraphs of a lot of complicated words that you probably don't see in everyday life. And what you're going to have to do is infer the tone of the author who wrote those words and what they're trying to get across to you in a concise way. There are some exercises you might be able to do. I think reading a lot of different sources is a great idea if you have the time for it. I think another thing you can do is when you're going through these practice passages, you can just knock them out paragraph by paragraph and say, like, what was the main intention of this paragraph and what was like a one-liner of what it conveyed. And then at the end, go through and state like the thesis of the entire essay to yourself, and then kind of match up with the questions and the answers later on to see if you were right. If that's in fact what they were trying to convey to you with that essay.
Awesome. I think you both gave some great tips here. All right. So testing structure. Talk a little bit about what the test day actually looks like.
Yeah. So it flies by. It really does, and I think this seems like there's a lot of stuff going on, but it's fairly intuitive for the most part. And you'll have taken so many practice tests that this will feel like second nature. But when you step into the testing room, they're going to do a certification on the screen. They're going to do an optional tutorial, which takes you through maybe a practice question or two, lets you click on the right answer, gives you all the bells and whistles that the testing platform has, highlighting, stuff like that. Then you kind of jump right into it. So you start with, the chemical and physical foundations, let's say, and you get the number of questions and time allotted. Then there are breaks that you can take. These breaks are optional, and you have a certain amount of time you can take. So the first break is 10 minutes. The mid-exam break is 30 minutes. The third break is 10 minutes between each section. So you don't really take a break within the sections, but after each one. And then there's a question that they usually ask you at the end that is not actually counted for anything. I think that's more like a research type of thing they do. That's the void question, if I'm not mistaken. Marathon, but you guys all get through it just like we did.
Great. Dita, any other thoughts here about, I don't know, should you be taking the breaks? Any thoughts about how to think about this time and make it seem a little bit less packed and stressful?
Yeah, I'd say take the breaks. Like, you don't even have to take the full 10 minutes, but if it's just to like get up and stretch your legs and just like move around a little bit, you might go through one section and you're feeling great, you're full of adrenaline, and then you think you're just going to power through, and then halfway through the next section, that's when you start to drop and falter a little bit, and then you'd wish you had taken that break. So even if it's just to stand up for 1 or 2 minutes, just to shake your legs out and get back to it, that'd be great. And then that tutorial at the beginning, you can think of that as like an extra break if you wanted to. Like, if you have like pre-test butterflies, you can use those 10 minutes to like, do some deep breathing or something to try and calm yourself down. Or if you can just kind of barrel through, either way works, depending on what you know about yourself.
All right. So just tips for just beginning to prepare for the MCAT.
Yeah. So even before you start studying for the MCAT, the first thing you're going to have to do is figure out a good schedule, one that you'll be able to keep to and hold yourself accountable by. And a lot of this is influenced by what you have going on in the rest of your life. If you're studying for the MCAT during a school semester, your schedule is going to look a lot different than someone who's either taking maybe a gap year or someone who's trying to take it during the summer. So really trying to understand how much time you have and be realistic about how much time you need to give yourself. If you're studying during the semester, you might want to give yourself a couple more months, because you're not going to be able to dedicate full days as someone who's doing it during the summer. It's okay to be humble with yourself and know that, some people will start a little bit with less knowledge than other people, but everyone's going to get to the same point. So just knowing where you're at, and then again, figuring out how much you need to study to get to the finish line, just like everyone else. And then we'll go through study materials a little bit later specifically, but just right off the bat, highly recommend question banks. I think that's one of the best places to really understand what they're asking you.
Great. Neil, any other thoughts here?
No, I don't think so. I think we got a lot of detail coming.
All right.
Yeah. So study strategies, I think, are personalized and tailored to each individual person that's studying. I think you guys have done a lot of studying up to this point. You guys are like professional test takers by now, most likely. So I think you will have some ideas of how you like to approach these things. what we're going to give you is just some recommendations, maybe from personal experience, that we think might be a helpful framework to start from and build off of. So some of the core parts of that framework, I think, are combining practice with content review. So the way I like to approach it, and Aditya can totally chime in with things he think a different way if he did it. I like to start with content review, kind of get a bit of the basics under my belt about what I'm doing, and then start weaving in some practice questions. And then again, cycle back to content review to kind of reinforce concepts as I go with the practice questions. And that's something I use later on too in medical school and now residency. I always start untimed because my first goal is accuracy, and then time I think comes later. So making sure I actually know the content, and then kind of working on whittling down the time it takes me to get to those correct answers. And this third check mark here is my biggest tip to people when I tutor them for the MCAT. It's just take as many practice tests as possible. That, for me, at least in my own life and the people I've tutored, has been the #1 predictor of a higher score. It's just the number of practice tests you've taken and the time you've taken to sit down, make yourself familiar with the test, and do that over and over again until it's second nature. While you're doing that, try to simulate real test conditions and learn how to deal with distractions at the same time. There might be that person next to you who's just, a nuisance. They're not the person you want to be seated next to in a test center, but they're the person you have to be seated next to, and you gotta phase that out. A lot of these testing centers now, they have headphones and things like that that can kind of cancel some noise around you, but try to be able to deal with a distraction here or there. And this entire process is going to be stressful for you guys. We know that. We've been through it as well. And I think learning early on, and you probably have some strategies for this already, but learning early on how to manage that stress is super important, I think, to making sure that you are calm and relaxed on test day, making sure that you can retain information while you're studying, and just making sure you have a better work-life balance during this period in your life. And deliberate practice, never just do things to do them. Try to really make an effort while you're doing practice questions or while you're reviewing content to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. How would this apply on a real test day? And try to go deeper to make sure you really understand the basics behind the test you're taking.
Thanks for taking us through that. Aditya, any other thoughts here?
Yeah, I also agree with my biggest tip is like building stamina and endurance. That's the way to make it through, because you can be really good at answering these questions in the first hour, but then the 5th or 6th hour still counts as much as the first hour. So being able to get through and still answer in an accurate manner is really important. And then, like as many tests as possible, see how many you have access to. And then I was like scheduling one every 1-2 weeks up until my test. And again, it's just, you give yourself a week. Okay, this is what I got wrong. I'm going to take this week to study all the stuff that I got wrong. I'm going to try again. And then, hopefully you just incrementally build up over time.
Fantastic. All right, on test day, test taking strategies.
Yeah. So the one that I also struggle with this one as well, because I feel like you have to study up until the test day, but I'm realizing more and more that it is probably better to give yourself 1 day of break right before. And so that's usually my routine now, even in medical school, is kind of how I did it, where you study really hard and you realize that most of your growth is happening in those weeks before, and what you're going to do in that last day isn't going to really matter as much. So if you want to, just maybe do a little bit, like a light day, right? But cut yourself off at noon, or cut yourself off so that you at least have a half day free to do other things. And you'll realize you're much more well rested and ready for the test, and less anxious afterwards. Snacks and food are also very, very important. And again, like we think about this like marathon runners, right? Like we're not going to be starving ourselves. We're not going to be overtraining or undertraining, and then we just start running this marathon, right? This is like a weeks-long, months-long process to get us to this point that we're going to be ready for this big jump. And so having healthy habits like eating right and taking care of yourself are also very, very important. arrive a little early and make sure all your requirements are there. You'd hate to be that one person who you forgot your driver's license and you just spent 6 months studying for this exam. Now you got to reschedule it for another month. So make sure you have everything with you and then arrive early, just so, again, you're not rushing. You're there. You give yourself a little bit of time to compose yourself, and then you just go into it and have a great day.
Neil, any other thoughts here?
Yeah, no, I agree initially with Aditya that I was the type of person who would study right up until the test when I kind of started this whole process as a pre-med. I'm also realizing, more and more that is pointless. At least the last few hours, last night before the test is not really going to do much for you. The one tip I would say maybe that has helped me, I think, here or there is if I've missed a question or a concept like 3 times, I write it down as a sort of cram sheet, maybe like the day before the test. So in the morning or the afternoon before my test, I'll just go over that cram sheet, hoping it'll stick in my head for 24 hours. And then I get to my test and sometimes it showed up. So I think that is, if you're the type of person that needs to do something the day before, that might be something you could think about doing.
Or all those equations that they might ask you about.
Yeah, right.
Those are some great tips. I think that wraps us up. I think just for Q&A sake here, Aditya and Neil, do you want to just say what you wish you had done differently? I mean, it sounds like you wouldn't have studied till the day of when you were taking the MCAT, but anything else that you wish you had known, you wish that you had done differently or changed while you were in the process of studying that really helped you, and advice that you give to your clients?
I think I'd do a little bit more of it's a technique pretty common in med school, spaced repetition. I think if I'd done a little bit of that in medical school, I think that would have been effective. Maybe would have helped me study a little bit more effectively. I clearly did fine, but it's just about, I remember my strategy was, okay, I'm going to read the book front to end, and then, okay, like 2 weeks later, I'm going to do the same thing and just like review everything that I highlighted. And if I maybe kept a better track of, okay, this is probably what I'm not as good at, or maybe this is what I want to circle more, and then target those certain pages, that might have been a little bit more effective.
Can you just give a quick overview of spaced repetition?
Yeah, so spaced repetition. So there's a software that a lot of medical students use called Anki, which kind of does it for you. It's these like this flashcard software, but essentially you start off fresh with all your concepts, and there are going to be some that you're familiar with and some that you're not familiar with. So spaced repetition is the ones that you are not comfortable with. Those are the ones that you should be seeing more often and more frequently. But the concepts that you do know very well, it's okay to not review that for like the next month or the next 2 months, because you're going to know it like the back of your hand. And the goal of that is you see the difficult content so much that the difficult content starts to become easier and easier until it also becomes the easy content. And that way you're always headfirst going to the difficult content and getting through that before you go through everything else that you know.
That makes a lot of sense. What about you, Neil?
Yeah. So I think I was a big procrastinator when I was in college, and that made for a very stressful lead up to test day. I think I would have spaced out my studying a bit more. Definitely started as early as I could, really maybe a couple months before the test, like 3-4 months at least, to kind of start reviewing materials. I would basically take a light load that semester and kind of just go through study materials up until test day, and maybe take the last couple of weeks off just to study if you can before the test, if that's possible for you. But I crammed it all in really right up until the end. So I think that was it. Again, it worked out okay, but it was not a pleasant experience. And I agree also with spaced repetition and repetition in general. I didn't know about Anki when I was in undergrad. I think that's a great software to use for spaced repetition. But in general, I think the more reps you get in of the material, the more it's going to be solidified in your brain. So if you can do like full passes through your MCAT textbook, and then make another pass through it, I think you'll kind of fill in all the little cracks that you might have had the first time you went through and really solidify your knowledge base.
These are some great study tips. Thank you both. All right. Well, I want to thank you both for coming and to everyone for joining us today. I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Be on the lookout for an email coming with a recording of this webinar. And yeah, Aditya and Neil, thank you so much for being here and walking us through this.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone.